turn to today's webinar. The Sustainable and Human Environmental Systems, or SHES Roundtable, represents an ongoing effort by academics, program directors, administrators, environmental agency personnel, and practitioners to produce a living set of consensus-based recommendations concerning the pedagogical and administrative aspects of interdisciplinary and higher-order sustainability education. The Roundtable's vision is the emergence of societies that facilitate, enhance, and sustain indefinitely in that facilitated or enhanced state the well-being of human individuals, their communities, and their environments, while its pedagogical goal is to empower learners to contribute to the realization of that vision. This is part one of a three-part series focusing on the background of the SHES Roundtable, including the forces that brought the Roundtable together and informed its work, and the fundamentals of the SHES view of the academic field, including the SHES vision, mission, and goal. This webinar will also introduce the important principles of the SHES approach, including systems thinking, social learning, including ethics and stakeholder values, supradisciplinarity, and complexity. This webinar will set the foundations for the upcoming webinars on the SHES pedagogical approach and examples, which will take place in February, and the administration and evaluation of SHES programs, a webinar that will occur in March. Let me briefly introduce the three members of the SHES Roundtable who will be presenting today. Michael Reiter is professor and chair of the Department of Integrated Environmental Science at Bethune-Cookman University. He holds a BS in biology from Muskingum and an MS in biology from Kent State and a PhD in environmental sciences from University of Virginia. His primary research is in integrated ecosystem management, focusing on the development and application of interdisciplinary stakeholder-based methods for addressing wicked environmental problems from a systems perspective. He is a past president and counselor for the Interdisciplinary Environmental Association, associate editor for the international journal Interdisciplinary Environmental Review, and he is a founding co-chair of the SHES Roundtable. Michael Humphreys is Associate Professor of Ethics in the School of Graduate and Professional Studies at Bethune-Cookman. He holds the PhD with distinction in Social and Environmental Ethics from Drew University, and a Master's in Divinity from Drew University, and a Bachelor's in Physical Science from the Coast Guard Academy. His primary academic interests include restorative justice and ecological sustainability. Dr. Humphreys has been teaching at the college university level for over 17 years. Prior to his work in higher education, he completed commissioned service in the U.S. Coast Guard. He's worked with academics, other regulators, environmental activist groups, concerned citizens, and industry representatives on cooperative preparedness and prevention initiatives in coastal and environmentally sensitive regions of Maine and New Hampshire. Finally, Rick Smardon is the State University of New York Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus in the Department of Environmental Studies at SUNY's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. He has a PhD in environmental planning from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's in landscape architecture and a bachelor's in environmental design from University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He's written 6 books. He's the co-author with 3 others of Revitalizing Urban Waterway Communities, and a 7th book, Education for a Sustainable Human and Environmental Systems, published by CRC Routledge, where he's a co-author with other members of the SHES Roundtable. His major areas of expertise include landscape assessment and management, wetland assessment and mitigation, environmental management, citizen participation, ecotourism, and energy sustainability planning implementation. With that introduction drawn from the announcement for this webinar, I'd like to turn the floor over to Michael Reiter, who will kick things off for our panelists. Michael?
Thank you very much, Ira, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Good afternoon or good morning, as the case may be where you are. Our goal today is to try to give you some indication of the background of this rather sizable effort that's been underway for more than a decade in order to try and address some of the important pedagogical issues in interdisciplinary and higher order education in environmental fields. We will begin here. Come on, go. There we go. The origin of the SHES Roundtable, and we've actually had a number of names as we've worked over the years. Our name has changed as our perception of the discipline has changed. But primarily, we were formed through the intersection of two separate lines of inquiry, which seemed to be going on at the same time, say 12 to 15 years ago. The first line of inquiry was coming from academics and practitioners in any number of associations. They were interested in trying to get a handle on interdisciplinary and higher order environmental education, but as would be appropriate for academics and practitioners, they were primarily interested in methods or in teaching approaches or in designing programs for transferring this type of information. And while those were going on, however, in another set of groups and other organizations, we had administrators who were focusing on very similar types of things, but from the perspective of an administrator. They were interested primarily in the core competencies that such programs would be transmitting. They were concerned about promotion and tenure issues associated with a subject that was quite often team taught or field oriented or public oriented. They were also interested in getting a handle on faculty careers in this field. What would they look like? What would someone who was tenured in this field be doing for publication, for their promotion portfolios, for service to the university? These things were going on together. And interestingly, a number of the individuals who led to the origin of the roundtable were actually in one or the other of these two lines. And as time went on, recognized that there was a gap, there was a hole. We were dealing with a large-scale, potentially holistic field of study, yet we weren't approaching the discipline from a holistic perspective. And what happened was, over time, the two lines ended up merging. You had individuals that were in the academics and practitioners groups and individuals who were in the administrators groups who got together and talked about this fact that these things necessarily needed to go together, and formed a group that tried to merge the two lines of effort. That merging group is now the Sustainable Human and Environmental Systems Roundtable. So the group has brought together teachers, practitioners, administrators, all in the same place to discuss the nuts and the bolts of the interdisciplinary environmental field, which eventually drifted to the sustainability field. The ultimate goal for the group was to devise a set of consensus-based guidelines. So guidelines that all the different perspectives could agree on, that could be used by people to design environmental programs, design sustainability programs, and evaluate those particular programs from an interdisciplinary or higher order perspective. We were hoping way back when that if we could do this, that would help to strengthen sustainability type programs and their reputation in academia, and that hopefully the set of proposals that we could put together would lead to models for program development in locations that wanted to take on something of this type, and perhaps one day reaching the point where we could get to a certification or accreditation type of thing. Because one of the early concerns of individuals in the group was that a student could sign up for a program in environmental blank, say, or sustainability blank, where that blank could be any number of terms. And the student wouldn't necessarily know what type of program they were stepping into. They might be stepping into a program to help them design sewage treatment plants. They might be stepping into a program to help them analyze social structures in Central America. They might be stepping into a program that was field-oriented and was going to help them to figure out how to collect samples in wetlands in the South. That was something that we were hoping we could get some handle on and perhaps provide some clarity. And so the Roundtable, therefore, has been working since 2007 to address what we considered to be the big questions of the field, quote unquote. Those big questions were, first of all, can we pedagogically identify sustainability as an academic field, along with all the other academic fields, and what that would look like? Once we did that, could we actually figure out how to effectively design such programs? If this is what the academic field is, and this is what we're trying to accomplish, what type of program would you design to effectively reach those goals? And then third, once you've designed that program, could we imagine a way to effectively support such programs within the academic enterprise, within colleges and universities? And could we figure out a way to evaluate such programs to tell whether they were actually reaching the goals that we felt were appropriate for this particular discipline? So we don't have a tremendous amount of time to go over all the details and all the wrangling. It's taken a really long time to reach this particular point. We're going to try and hit some of the highlights coming out of the background of the SHES Roundtable. We can answer questions on some of the details or nitty-gritty of what's behind it, or the book can certainly give you more details also. But what types of things are included in the Roundtable effort? Things such as this: name and program identity, the overarching paradigm of the discipline, curricular approaches to the discipline, those that are effective, those that may not be, knowledge areas and core competencies in the discipline, program design models, organizational structure models, and what type of faculty you would need for those types of program designs in the discipline. Administrative placement within the college or university structure. Where would these types of programs fit and operate best? And then evaluation of programs in this discipline, both criteria and process. Issues of accreditation versus certification, which would be more appropriate, which would be more effective, which would be sufficient for the task. And then other sets of considerations for successful education in this discipline. They tend to arise organically as the group has taken on some new task, some new thought, some new concern, other things appear. And in truth, the Roundtable has had to go backwards several times over its work in order to change past proposals, in order to keep everything coherent and to keep everything tied to the founding principles, the first principles of the field. So these are the types of things that we've been playing with and we're continuing to play with. So what do we have? The field of sustainable human and environmental systems focuses on what we consider to be the SHES supersystem. Okay? There are environmental subsystems to this SHES supersystem, things like the atmosphere and the hydrosphere, the geosphere, the biosphere. There are also some part of the SHES supersystem. There are social systems, technological systems, economic systems, governance systems. Notice in the diagram, there is no hard boundary between these. We use the terms environmental systems and human systems as a matter of convenience to help categorize things. But truth be told, all of the different systems in the SHES supersystem are interacting with each other, and that is taken into account in our course designs, in our course structures, and everything else along the way. But we're working from this basic concept. We've worked over the years to try and develop an idea of what exactly the field is. And there is a vision for our approach to education. Our vision involves sustainable societies, specifically to promote the emergence of societies that facilitate, enhance, and sustain indefinitely the well-being of human individuals, their communities, and their environments. All three of these are important to our vision of the SHES method. They're important to the goal of sustainable societies, and therefore they are all integrated into the academic approach that we have developed. That vision then gives way to the SHES mission. The SHES mission, therefore, is the development of viable systems and their maintenance. We need to sustain the viability of human and environmental systems through the maintenance of their structural integrity, their functional utility, their adaptive resilience, and the number and diversity of system interactions in order to support the vision. So if we're going to reach the vision of sustainable societies, we must have these viable systems in place and we must maintain them. Now, so any system regimes that are consistent with the SHES mission should be preserved, and we want to keep them resilient. So we want to prevent transitions to less sustainable regimes. We remember, a lot of us, the old ball and basin model. You have the system state, the marble, and the system states can change inside of the regimes cyclically or linearly. It might change naturally, or it might change due to some particular anthropogenic forces. As long as that system is viable and resilient and leads to all three of the utility, resilience, integrity, and supports viable systems, everything is fine. What we want to avoid, or perhaps return from if we go too far, are system states that enter non-sustainable regimes. That gray bowl over there. We want to get back from that, or we want to prevent that from happening. Now, science can tell us a lot about this type of behavior and help us to make a lot of predictions as to what might happen. One thing, however, that's often left out of these academic approaches is the social learning aspect. And Rick Smardon is going to give us a little more detail on the social learning aspect of the SHES approach.
So good morning or afternoon to all you that are with us today. So if we're dealing with a classroom, or we're dealing with multiple stakeholders, with an inside-outside situation, we feel strongly that social learning is really the key in terms of one of the approaches. And if we want to build knowledge, or look at capacity, or the commitment to the viability of human environmental systems and their interactions. So this is really some of our strongest tools that we hope to utilize in terms of this approach. Next slide, please.
Come on, there it is. Sorry.
Okay. So really we're moving from cognition or understanding to behavior to the interaction of this as we look at environment. So we're looking at the learner models of cognition and behavior through social interaction. So as we run through looking at different levels of complexity or viability of sustainability, this is one of the major tools that we're using. So this is one of our primary means of both motivating both individuals or students, if you will, or communities to move toward a more sustainable state. Next slide, please. So we have lots of examples of social learning. It's one of my favorite tools in terms of both in the classroom and outside, looking at different environmental situations. So we can have multi-loop type of learning. We can have different kinds of collaborative processes. We're in the classroom, the students are doing as much as the faculty in terms of moving through looking at these sustainable situations. We can have situated learning that is really place-specific. We're dealing with a place-specific type of sustainability analysis. And we can even have transformational types of learning situations where we're really trying to move beyond where our thinking is at the current state and time. Also, students and faculty can do backcasting. It's one of our favorite techniques where instead of forecasting forward, we're trying to construct stuff from a desired state and working backwards to figure out how we get there. And one of my favorite techniques is what I call co-production, that as we're in the classroom or we're working with stakeholders, we're really working together stage by stage and acquiring knowledge, acquiring understanding, and looking at alternatives as we move through a sustainability issue. So the key is beginning to end of everybody being on the same page, or at least the same level of activity moving through this kind of process. So next slide, please. So our challenge, basically, as we try to move and attain the SHES vision, is to use social learning as one of our major tools in terms of getting to where we need to go. And so we have adopted 6 principles in responding to this challenge. Ira? Excuse me, Mike?
Thanks, Rick. Okay, so in order to get to education for sustainability, encompassing all of those ideas plus the social learning in order to reach the vision and the mission, the Roundtable has adopted 6 principles to try and accomplish that challenge. The first is operation in systems thinking. The SHES Roundtable believes that education for sustainability is best viewed as a study of interconnected human and environmental systems. SHES is an interface discipline. Now, as I said earlier when we were taking a look at that diagram, the Roundtable recognizes that there is no clear distinction or boundary between what we would call human systems and what we would call environmental systems. There's rather only a collection of different types of systems that are integrated and interrelated. SHES, therefore, is an interface discipline, and the best way to get at interface concepts from the perspective of the roundtable and this particular approach is to utilize systems thinking. The second principle is holism. We believe that there is a need for a holistic view that accommodates all of the interconnections, this collection of relationships among the human and environmental systems. There isn't just one interaction that's necessarily driving almost all of the big issues that we have. There are all kinds of repercussions, all kinds of driving factors, all kinds of aspects to them, and all kinds of results from those interactions. In order to get a relatively complete picture of what's going on and what we might need to do, we need to be able to take those in some larger scale. Therefore, the principle of holism becomes important to the SHES perspective and, as a result, to SHES education. Which means, logically, the concept of supradisciplinarity comes into play. If you're interested in these large scales and capturing as many of these connections as you can at a systems level, then education for that is going to need to be able to look at many of these things at once. Our traditional approach of layering, where you look at things one way and then another way and then another way, really doesn't get to the connections and the interactions that are driving many of the sustainability issues that we have today. So our single lens approaches tend to be limited. The cross-disciplinary lenses, the successive approaches, look at it from A, look at it from B, look at it from C. If they retain their disciplinary boundaries, well, that's a little bit better than single views, but still limited. You're still maintaining the existence of disciplines, and you're still using disciplinary concepts and methods. That has practical implications for approaching interdisciplinary education. Unidisciplinary approaches, multidisciplinary approaches, and transdisciplinary approaches, utilizing the connotations of those prefixes, are going to have a difficult time capturing the important interactions and drivers in sustainability education as far as the roundtable is concerned. You can start to get to where you need to be from pluridisciplinary approaches, where your focus is primarily on the intersections between disciplines rather than specific disciplines one at a time or two or three successively. Best for dealing with sustainability education as far as the roundtable is concerned is interdisciplinary or supradisciplinary approaches. Supradisciplinary approaches, however, are very challenging. To work completely across all disciplines all the time with no view toward boundaries or disciplinary separation is a very challenging thing to do. However, interdisciplinary approaches do exist. They have been used for quite some time. We have disciplines that are effectively interdisciplines, like natural ecology, or many of the studies, like American studies. These types of things can be functionally utilized. As far as the roundtable is concerned, the further along in this chart you can get, the more you will be able to capture the necessary interactions between human and environmental systems that would be needed in order to diagnose and approach different types of sustainability issues. Now, a quick thing on trans versus supra, because there are different uses of these prefix in the literature and in conferences and public discussion. There are two views of transdisciplinarity that both purport to rise above disciplines. Some use the prefix trans, some use the prefix supra. They both emphasize stakeholder involvement. Supra program approaches tend to rely on a synthesis of stakeholder views, and that synthesis is usually not discipline-based. It's the views of the stakeholders and what they consider to be important and critical. The trans-type approaches tend to focus on power disparities. They're interested in realigning power more equitably. Both of those things are useful. In the roundtable, we emphasize stakeholder involvement throughout, both because of our concern with social learning in order to reach our vision and mission, and because we have a focus on well-being within our approach. Super system specification utilizes it, valuation, viability assessment, the formulation of sustainable alternatives, and then of course the social learning itself have this stakeholder tie. We use supra then instead of trans. Well, we wish to be true to Latin prefix meanings and because of the stakeholder emphasis. You'll also see as we get into more detail on the actual pedagogical approach, especially in the second part of the series, that system complexity thinking is a very important aspect of our approach, and we actually blend that with stakeholder views and power sharing issues into one view of the sustainability situation. So we use Supra within our approaches and within the roundtable. Moving on up to program design, if you take a look at the organization of courses in such environmental and sustainability education programs, you tend to see some patterns to them. The triangle pattern, where the early courses are relatively broad, relatively holistic, and then as you move on in the program, your focus gets narrower and narrower onto specific tasks, specific tools, specific circumstances. There are also inverted triangle programs where you learn very specific types of approaches and procedures first, and then as you learn to utilize them, you broaden your viewpoint. These two are very common within undergraduate program designs. Somewhat more complicated program designs, you tend to see these in graduate program structures. You have the diamond approach, where the initial coursework is specific to a particular discipline or two. You then broaden your perspectives through application and then focus on one particular thing that you, the student, are going to work on. Alternatively, there are other programs which have a very broad perspective, more holistic courses to begin with. Then in the middle of the program, they learn sets of tools that tend to come from particular disciplines, and then they learn how those tools can be used to address these broader issues. So your focus spreads out again. That's actually the type of program that we built here. It is possible to imagine an extensional program where you start with relatively simple issues, work your way through the program to far more complex issues, but you are always being holistic. If you consider those types of programs, the first two really don't facilitate integration among different disciplines, so it's hard to get at these interaction issues. This last one, very difficult to do. You need very particular types of faculty. You have a challenge ahead of you making that fit within administrative structures, and showing employers or graduate or higher graduate programs what those students can do and how they can do them. This one right here, the roundtable has considered to be probably the most practically effective at the time, given the types of universities, the types of programs that already exist, the types of faculty that tend to be available. You could probably design a program like this and get at least a good fraction of the interaction type issues that would be important to sustainability without having to create something that is so different you're going to develop another set of problems for yourself. The fourth principle comes from revealed complexity. Our pedagogic approach is based on revealing complexity from simple situations, sustainability situations, through complicated ones to complex ones. The simple sustainability situations are the recipe-driven ones. They're very easy to replicate once you've addressed it here. Addressing it there is not particularly difficult. Your skills improve with experience, and you don't necessarily need a lot of expertise for success. You can often do it just by checking out, reading about how someone else did it, and put it in place yourself. More complicated sustainability situations, you might have a high degree of certainty, but it's going to involve application of some formulas, perhaps some equations and models. There's going to be some level of expertise necessary to reach some type of success. And you're going to have to be able to track a number of different applications and interactions in order to accomplish anything that might be considered to be success. The complex situations are what we often refer to as wicked problems. Every situation is different. Experience at one location doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be better at addressing it in another location. There don't tend to be formulae that can be applied here and then there. There's a relatively high degree of uncertainty, and you can have expertise in these situations, but that expertise just comes from having seen a number of different variants on the theme. There's no guarantee that having seen all these other variants on the theme, you're going to be able to get it right this time. Complexity is actually an important issue in SHES. We define complexity as the number and diversity of systems and their interactions, the values attributed to them, and associated irreducible uncertainties. So we're tracking all of these things at the same time. The more of these different things that are present, the more complex the situation is considered to be. Of course, the measure of complexity depends on how systems are delimited and how they're valued. And if you've ever worked with wicked problems, you recognize that those, when you have different groups of stakeholders, they may view the complexity of the system differently. They may have different values in place for these things. And as a result, what ultimately ends up being the way that the group decides to address those is different, because the values are different, the perception of the complexity is different. Within SHES, the use of revealed complexity is used actually within the curriculum. You can gradually increase the revealed complexity to move students toward a more holistic understanding of systemic relationships. Start with the simplest types of sustainability issues, work up toward more complex types of issues in order to, in essence, acclimatize the student to working across more than one set of interactions at any particular time. The more complexity that is revealed to the students, or better yet, the more complexity that is revealed by the students, the better then they're going to be served in meeting the SHES vision, mission, and goal. Because identifying and revealing that the complexity involved in our sustainability situations is key to trying to reach, maintain, or put in place sustainable systems. Social learning, which Rick Smardon has already told us about, is a principle in the SHES approach to education, and that includes all the different types of modes that he described, the collaborative, situated, the double loop approaches, experiential learning. All of these things are aimed at developing a shared understanding of sustainable societies, the shared understanding of the capacity needed to reach those, and a shared commitment to reach those sustainable societies. And that is accomplished through things like conflict management, trust building, futures thinking, backcasting, systemic approaches that actually appreciate and can even utilize the complexity that we were talking about. The sixth principle then is stakeholder engagement. Stakeholders have to be engaged in deliberations concerning the sustainability situation that exists. What is well-being considered to be in this perspective? The elements involved in the super system, the interventions. There are a lot of stakeholder-based value judgments that are involved that cannot be ignored. They must be incorporated. So our vision seeks to indefinitely sustain the well-being of individuals, their communities, and their environments. We have to know what the well-being of individuals and their communities is perceived to be, as well as their environments. And definitions of well-being are subjectively constructed. They vary across individuals, they vary across time. And the super system elements that are valued then depend upon the definitions of well-being that are in place. So, stakeholder engagement, therefore, becomes very important to defining well-being, coming up with those values, determining the appropriate scales, and coming up with intervention strategies. It is so important that we want to go into this a little more. Michael Humphreys will dig into this particular approach.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. One of the major parts of this whole enterprise that picks up on the importance of varied definitions of well-being and the parts of a super system that are valued is a portion of this that's focused on ethics, all the while living with the larger vision of the SHES framework, where different perspectives, different ways of knowing intersect. The first part of this recognizes that working towards sustainability is quite a challenge, and in the slide that illustrates stage one, there are two phases that repeat themselves over and over again. Phase 1A emphasizes the identification of stakeholders who are concerned about well-being, the identity or the identification of what threats they might perceive, the values that they have that are both diminished or impaired, and the things that they really care about that are promoted or or provided for in some way. So an emphasis on stakeholders and what they value and how they understand well-being, inclusive of threats to that well-being, followed by phase 1B, which reveals the systemic complexity of the situation itself by examining the interactions, how those interactions intersect what they value, conceptualizing the systems and the interactions, and so forth. The bottom of the slide, the next piece, then illustrates that the two phases repeat themselves to get a better picture of what's going on. The resolution increases. As each round happens, this large, very complex kind of situation, portions of it will be in focus earlier than others. And as it repeats, it gets more clear with each iteration. And the complexity is then revealed in increasingly robust ways. All the while, there's an emphasis on what people value, how they're connected, why they're stakeholders, what they're concerned about, and so forth. When values are revealed in such a way with a focus on well-being in the process that you've just seen, it can create a more holistic and nuanced understanding of what societal well-being means and what particular parts of society might recognize as intrinsic to their own well-being. There's value complexity is increased as more and more perspectives about well-being are considered. They will be various. They're culturally conditioned. Different constituencies from different social locations will value things sometimes in very different ways. Once all of that is out and the resolution of it has increased so that it's increasingly clear in terms of complexity, then expert valuation is brought to bear to determine whether some of those are positive and promote sustainability and some of them are negative and lead away from sustainability, all the while recognizing that what different constituencies value will be quite various. And some of them will intersect well, some of them will take some negotiations, some compromises, some trade-offs, and so forth. But the composite, what's left, is revealed by the diversity of the definitions that are involved, the interactions that merit priority, the viability assessment and social learning all works into this. So a comment on valuation and ethics. We've said some about how various different constituencies might elaborate, express, or understand what they value in terms of promoting sustainability, promoting things they care about, and so forth. Values in and of themselves, bringing some understanding of ethics to bear, kind of recalling that hourglass that we saw a bit ago. There are some tools that ethics can add into this whole process that helps further the goals of the roundtable. And one of those understandings, a kind of tool, is a sense that values express what a person or a group might recognize as moral. Our morality is expressed in terms of what we value. Ethics, tied to that, focuses on how we live into what we value, what our practices might be, what we might embody, understanding there's a connection between who we are and what we do and so forth. Ethics is concerned about why and how you get there. And so in an understanding of ethics, it becomes apparent in the literature and otherwise that there are many different approaches to doing ethics. Focus on well-being is one, focus on principles is another, for instance. And while there's a number of different approaches to ethics, there's a particular approach that resonates quite well with the SHES framework, and that is restorative justice. Restorative justice is focused upon restoring relationships, making things right again, dealing with the harms that some have experienced. Those who are involved, whether they were harmed or did harm, face one another, restoring right relationships. Doing that is an expression of doing justice. That's, in a nutshell, what restorative justice is. But one of the things that comes out of performing a restorative justice kind of initiative is that what people value, what they recognize as beneficial, and in particular, what and all the different ways that they've been harmed comes to light. So the values focus in SHES is supported by doing an initiative like restorative justice. It can reveal a considerable amount of complexity. The ethics that restorative justice is based upon is a kind of ethics that can embrace complexity quite well. It's not just a matter of working towards aims and outcomes or principles or whatnot. It's far more robust than that, centering on a person's own lived experience. Conscience is a part of that, and so forth. So restorative justice has been included because it's a tool that is useful toward the aims of the SHES approach and recognizes the role that ethics plays in living toward or embodying what we value.
Thanks very much, Mike. We went through the steps in stage one. One thing that might be worth mentioning here is that not only has the roundtable worked toward setting up this set of ideas and concepts and such from first principles of the field, but we have also laid out, in essence, a number of flow charts, pathways, so that people who do not have a background in this field but want to approach sustainability issues using a SHES perspective can step through these things, and they have a way to try and deal with it without necessarily drowning in the nuts and bolts and philosophy of the approach. This set of stages was one of them, where the first stage previously dealt with diagnosing the sustainability challenge. Stage two is where you come up with a sustainability prescription. You do alternate visioning exercises to analyze what is there, what aspects of the sustainability issue need to be addressed, how those might be changed, and what the implications of them if you do not revise or replace the alternatives. Then coming up with the super system components that will be affected by the alternative you decide would be better. You can increase system resolution as necessary in order to try and determine the potential effects, and then assess the viability of the alternative. In essence, what types of interventions would you need to take? What would you have to do within the super system to put in place the alternative? If you decide that the alternative you came up with based on this analysis is not viable after all, then you can go back and repeat these phases until you come up with one that analysis suggests would be more sustainable and would itself be viable. And then once you have that alternative, you implement it. You're interested in transforming the situation you have into the more societal, sustainable alternative. So you evaluate the effectiveness of that alternative. You might have to go back if you think putting it in place is not actually going to fit societal well-being. But if you think it does, then you can utilize social learning approaches in order to build the capacity to contribute to the emergence of that alternative and therefore to a more sustainable society. So the way that looks in diagrammatic form is, first of all, under diagnosis, you have some challenge you need to address. You look at the perspectives on well-being that are associated with that challenge. And by doing that, you reveal values that are important. And as you reveal that, you identify the valued systems and interactions that are necessarily involved in the values that are being revealed, as Mike mentioned earlier. And there are aspects to those valued system interactions. There are spatial ones, there are temporal ones, both cyclic and non-cyclic. There are functional aspects that need to be addressed, as well as dimensions of resolution into these. There are system levels and system interactions at various scales that you need to look at in order to get a decent picture of the sustainability challenge and what it represents, where the actual issues are. You thus then do your super system viability assessment to determine where within this you need to make adjustments in order to improve societal well-being. That takes you to stage 2, the prescription stage, where you end up trying to develop alternatives that could improve upon what you have. That you have to reveal complexity in those, so you have to take these things apart to be sure you understand where all those interactions go and where the systems are going to fit and interact, and then you make sure that the alternative itself appears to be viable and would be an improvement on the system that's leading to the challenge that you have. If you've got one, then you move to implementation. You're interested in how you transform the situation through different approaches to social learning. So you need to build capacity often in order to put everything in place at the social level in order to reach that alternative, in order to move yourself closer to sustainable societies. So what we tried to do here is give you an idea of all the ideas and attitudes and approaches that are underneath the SHES perspective to sustainability education. And we evaluate sustainability holistically through all stages of inquiry, and we preserve that holism within a supradisciplinary pedagogy. Robust framing is a critical aspect to understand the influences of all the different dimensions of scale and resolution and values inherent in the stakeholders' varying perspectives on what actually constitutes well-being. So by progressively revealing that complexity, a student can gain a more thorough and a more nuanced understanding of the interactions that are involved and the systems that are within those interactions that would be essential to achieving the vision and the mission. So any non-viable systems, any unsustainable systems, they can be the focus for targeted actions to try and improve the well-being of individuals, their communities, and their environments. And once you have those, you incorporate them into social learning strategies that can be used to encourage stakeholders to, you're going to have to put the actions in place, you're going to have to build the capacity in order to maintain them and promote those societies. And since any viability assessment have uncertainties, you do need intervention strategies that adapt and embrace adaptive management and the precautionary principle, because down the road things can change even if everything is wonderful today. that won't necessarily be the case tomorrow. Now, the interesting question then becomes, well, how in the world do you put this in the classroom? How do you teach students how to do that? And that will be actually the focus of the next webinar on February 13th, where we will focus on the SHES pedagogical approach and some actual course examples that utilize this approach within their design. And then on March 13th, if you're going to build programs on this, how in the world do you put it in a university structure and maintain it? And that will be the focus of part 3 of the webinar series on March 13th, where we will go over the administration and evaluation of SHES programs from the roundtable's perspectives. I thank you very much for being part of our webinar series, and Mike and Rick and I will do our best to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, that was a great presentation, guys. My thanks to all 3 of you. I'm glad, Mike, that you've noted the next 2 segments of this webinar series. And I also note on the slide that you have up there now the cover of the book, Education for Sustainable Human and Environmental Systems from Theory to Practice. While I await any further comments or questions that come in from the audience, let me just pose one to you, Mike, going back to the beginning of this webinar in the first few slides. You alluded to when you were talking about the basic evolution or history of this space in higher education, you use the word drifted in describing how environmental programs drifted to sustainability. I don't know whether we should be reading anything positive or negative into the use of that term, but then related to that, in addressing the big questions, you also had in that list, is sustainability to be viewed as a discipline? And so I throw those out together to give you an opportunity to comment on where you and the roundtable may stand now on whether sustainability should be viewed as a discipline. I don't want to detract from either of the 2 subsequent webinars, so we're happy for a stay tuned answer. But I was also curious about how you viewed the drift from environment to sustainability, and whether you, at least personally, see a distinction between interdisciplinary environmental programs and sustainability programs in higher education.
Yeah. If you had been involved in the actual roundtables, you would recognize how interesting a question that is. The hardest part, well, in a lot of disciplines, the hardest question is the first one. And we had quite a time trying to come up with definitions for environmental science, environmental studies, sustainability, all these types of things. There were all kinds of different perspectives. There were a lot of environmental blank programs, environmental science, environmental studies, environmental technology, engineering, that popped up in the later 1900s. The courses and programs in sustainability, quote unquote, appeared to come later. The roundtable considers the field to be sustainable human and environmental systems. That is the name of the field. Okay. And the book, all the vision, the mission, all of the the principles, all of the learning outcomes, all of that are actually tied to the field of sustainable human and environmental systems, which is broader and more holistic than, say, environmental science programs or environmental studies programs tend to approach things. That's not saying every single one of them do, but our approach has a very particular structure, a very particular goal in mind, a very particular aim to work toward that deals specifically with sustainability of the human and environmental systems that work together in order to keep us going, or keep our well-being in place. Certainly, the pedagogical aspects of that will be covered in the second webinar. We actually tried to set very specific definitions for those things at the beginning, and we gave up. We learned, as many other groups learn, that there are many potentially useful, viable approaches to it. We actually began to make a lot of headway when we used the definition by specification approach. That is very common in the sciences. We don't have an a priori definition for life or a living thing. We have this list of attributes that we have in place that living things or life has, and then we see what fits it. Well, that's precisely how we got some traction on our roundtable, was by setting aside the hours and hours of debates and arguments and charts and diagrams that we had for these different definitions and move to definition by specification for sustainability, because ultimately we felt that, why are you studying environmental systems? Why are you studying environmental studies? You're doing it in order to get a handle on the interactions between human beings and their surroundings, to the point where we can actually maintain our well-being. Well, so the sustainability part seemed to sit as an umbrella over the others. Therefore, we moved from the point of view of sustainability, we set our specifications for that and moved from there. And really, after that year and a half of trying to deal with the definitions, once we moved to that approach, things were relatively smooth.
Well, thanks for that background, Mike. And I would normally say that would be a great place for us to stop and await the next installment. But while we were going back and forth, another question did come in. So I think we do have time for that one remaining question, if you do. Catherine is asking us about social learning. And so the question is, what are some good examples of universities or colleges applying social learning?
Well, I certainly have some, but Rick, if you're still there, you probably know a lot more of them than I do.
Yeah, I think it boils down to some specific courses and maybe social learning. I'm thinking of University of California, Berkeley, the dean of the school, the College of Environment there, Walsh, is one of her major focuses is on social learning. I'm thinking about Judith Petts at Plymouth University in the UK, who pioneered some really good examples of waterway revitalization using social learning. There's some of the sociologists and the environmental sociologists have been using social learning in their curriculums and their courses. I don't know if it's a whole university, but I can definitely think of examples of individual faculty, individual courses. I can think of other examples where colleges and universities do a lot of work with community stakeholders and use social learning as part of that process. University of Wisconsin, Madison, I know there are examples of that. I know Joan Nassauer at the University of Minnesota has been utilizing that approach. Just a few examples.
What pops into my head is Unity College and their conversion of the college into social environmental concern. Probably Evergreen and Arizona State have at least large portions of their institution that work collectively on aspects of social learning issues. And most of these end up being tied to some community location or occupation. I know there's one in Seattle, but I can't remember the institution that's driving it now. It's refusing to come to my head. But there's an entire neighborhood in inner city Seattle where a particular university is working with them in order to address some of their sustainability issues. Darn, that bugs me. I can't remember.
Yeah, just a little plug for the book. There's a chapter that deals with the review of a lot of the programs across the country, including European and North American programs, and some of that would cover that question.
Well, again, as we were about to wrap up, I see a request for a comment from my old friend Jeff Potent, who is on the line and who has unmuted himself. So with the understanding that we'll end with the panel's response to Jeff's comment, Jeff, why don't you go ahead and make your comment relating to extension models?
Ira, thank you, and hello. It's been a good number of years. My name is Jeff Potent. I teach corporate and agricultural sustainability at Columbia University, and much of my career has been I've spent working within the agricultural and industrial extension world, Cornell University and other institutions, and there is tremendous value to the extension model in terms of offering a framework for applied research and education, and providing an opportunity to develop a rich array of case studies on the application of sustainability principles in various settings, whether it be community, agriculture, or business. And I see tremendous benefit in that. And if there's a way to explore how to work that into your educational framework, that would be fantastic. But I also bring a lot of caveats to that, because the extension system in this country has been significantly diminished as a result of loss of funding for a variety of substantive and political reasons. But I fear the baby is being thrown out with the bathwater, because there's tremendous value in being able to work with practitioners, bring a close partnership between campus-based faculty and extension agents and industry representatives and actual company people working within companies and students to advance the field. So I would love to explore that further as I look forward to staying involved with this group.
I agree with both of those things. I've actually worked at a couple of land-grant institutions before I came here, and there are aspects of that model approach that have actually been worked into this methodology. I developed my stakeholder-based resource management approach, the integrated assessment and ecosystem management protocol, out of a combination of the old VEC modeling approach and its extensions from the EPA, and some of those extension models that I got while I was working at land-grant institutions. There are pieces of it in here that are actually worked into the method.
Also for Jeff, I fully agree. I've worked both with forestry extension operations, agricultural extension operations, sea grant with the Great Lakes issues. I agree. There's a huge capacity, or to be able to move forward in that. And yes, the resources have been really constrained for some of these extension type organizations.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, with that, again, my thanks to Michael, Rick, and Michael for a great presentation. Thanks to the audience for some good questions and for sticking with us to the end here. And stay tuned for the next installment of this webinar series on February 13th. With that, we're signing off for today. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, everyone.